Okay, today my guest is Professor Yves Doz. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Yves as a person. Professor Doz is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Yves Doz is an emeritus professor at INSEAD. He's a fellow of the AOM, SMS, and AIB. He was the first recipient of the C.K. Prahalad Distinguished Scholar-Practitioner Award by the SMS in 2011. Professor Doz has authored many articles, books, chapters, cases for both academics and managers. He has received many awards, such as the George S. Terry Award from the AOM for Best Book on Management. In 2018, he received the Best Paper Awards at AOM's IM division, the Kearney AOM Award for Outstanding Research in General Management, and he has served as the President and Vice President of AIB. He also served on the editorial boards of AMR, JIBS, Journal of World Business, SMJ, Multinational Business Review, among others. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
First question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Oh, not very original, but I lived with my parents very close to the Orly airport, which at the time was the only big airport around Paris. And I was watching these constellations and stratocruisers roaring overhead. And I wanted to become an airline pilot. My poor eyesight put a quick end to that dream. So that was only for a few years.
So you grew up in Paris?
Yeah, I grew up just outside Paris, yes.
Okay. And can you remember the first points of memory that domestic versus foreign exist, that there's international world out there? Can you remember the first moment of awareness?
Yes, I was a kid also. My parents are both French, and they were, in a way, French domestic, I could say. My mother was a school principal. My father was working for the National Railroads. So both of them were working with very French organizations. But I had the eldest of my first cousins, who was more than 20 years older than I am, had a strange job. He was working for the how is it called? The aviation branch of the UN. The civil aviation branch of the UN. And his job was, among others, to go around the world and certify airports. So he would certify airports for safety, their radars, the length of their runways, whatever. And he lived in Montreal, but he would come to Paris relatively often, and he would stop for a day or two and see his parents. And he would also go and see my parents. And I remember him vividly because he was coming and having dinner with us, and he would have these tales from extraordinary exotic places he had just been to. And for me, it sounded like big adventure. So that was a very strong contrast with my parents' domestic experience. That's how I got international, in a sense, our first internationalization.
Interesting. So you, how did you choose to be a scholar?
Well, if I'm honest with you, I did not choose. I was chosen. No, seriously. I did a management school in France called HEC. And after that, still interested in aviation, I went to work for an aerospace equipment, a plane company, actually the helicopter business of a plane company. And after a couple of years, I realized that not being an aeronautical engineer, my potential was limited. So I was there, but not too happy. And a phone call came out of the blue from my former finance professor, international finance professor at HEC, saying, would you like to come and work with us on a research project on foreign investment? And I said, why not? So I went there, resigned from my aerospace job, worked as a research assistant, then as a very junior, I would not even say faculty, but pre-faculty, less than assistant professor, tutor, or something like this. And I liked it. So I realized that being a scholar was something I wanted to do or be. And I'd already had this international orientation. So that's how I became an IB scholar.
But you started with international finance, right? So you
Not
were an
exactly.
assistant.
Yeah, not exactly, because it was really around FDI, and basically we were trying to do, so far as I recall, we were trying to build some kind of model of market attractiveness for internationalizing companies and so on. So it was not finance narrowly defined; it was really international business.
I see.
Internationalization in a sense.
Something that is not on your CV, but people might find interesting.
Well, I don't know, except in the same line, I still keep an interest in aerospace. So I go to air shows, and when I can, I stop to visit aerospace museums, from Cape Canaveral to places. I regret there has never been an academic conference in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton is the home of the U.S. Air Force Museum. I dream to visit that museum before I pass away.
Well, I live in Cleveland. It's not too far away from us. I've never been there, but please do come and I'll take you there. We'll go visit together. So my understanding is, do you still need to have like 20/20 vision, perfect vision to fly these private planes, small Pipers?
Today, I don't know. Certainly when I was young, if you had the poor vision, that basically ruled you out. But
interesting. I know there's a height limit. There's a eyesight requirement, obviously, strong eyesight. But I didn't know anything about the private planes, especially with the single engine or two small
At some point, I was tempted to try to get a private pilot license, not to go for airlines, but just as small planes. And at the time, I was told my eyesight was not good enough. So, but that was like 30 years ago. So
okay. If you stopped doing what you're doing today and pursued a different career, what would you do?
I think I would stay with an academic scholar with scholarly work, and I think I could have been a historian. I have a lot of interest in history, and in a way, the kind of process research I do and the evolution of companies over time and so on is not very different from business history or from history. Robert Burgelman wrote in Gibbs a few years ago. There was a special issue on qualitative research methods, and he wrote a very nice piece drawing a parallel between history and management process research. I definitely, I mean, again, this is far distant past, but when I was a doctoral student at Harvard, I had Alfred Chandler as a teacher, among others, and Chandler certainly had an influence on me. And obviously, at the time, he was this very famous and remarkable business historian who had written this foundational book around strategy and structure and so on. So I was influenced by him, and I think I could easily have become a historian.
About regrets in life, things that you should have done, you would have done, you thought about doing but not pursuing later on. Any regrets in life?
I think, yes, that's a tough one. No, I think I was too much of a bookworm in a sense. I've been too much, I was too intellectual. That is something that my children have criticized me for, saying you were not available enough. You were always, thinking about your books and your books, the books you read or the books you were writing. So if I have one regret, is not to have been more available for my children when they were really small. Now I'm a grandfather, so I try to compensate, but it's not the same thing.
Okay. Well, what are you most passionate about?
Sorry?
What are you most passionate about?
What am I passionate?
Yeah.
Oh, I think I'm curious about one thing. I might also have been an investigative journalist, by the way, perhaps. I'm curious. I'm curious to observe how people work in organizations. Really, really trying to figure out. I have this curiosity of figuring out how an organization works, figuring how people relate within the organization. It's partly also when I think of history, when I read some history books, I mean, some of them are very rich on that dimension, not all, but some. So it's really figuring out how people work together in organizations.
Here, I mean, this is going to be an easy question for you. So say you're stranded on the side of the road. There's a pub, local pub. You go and locals meet you. Locals are curious about what you do, what you write about, how you earn your living. How do you explain what you do and the importance of your research to people who don't read academic work regularly?
I don't tell them I'm a bookworm. I don't tell them that I study the work of complex multinational organizations. I think I would tell them something, because in a way, when people work together, there is collaboration. So I would tell them really that what interests me is why people collaborate and why people don't. Under what set of circumstances, with what dynamics. And I might use some examples. I mean, there are wonderful examples from the US actually around the way villagers may band together to help each other build a barn. That seems to be a classic example, but not everyone does it. Perhaps not every villager participates, not every village does it, and so on. So I would say, why is it that in some circumstances people work together? They work together productively, they work together equitably, fairly, and in some other cases, they don't. And really, if we literally go back to Adam Smith, why are organizations existing? Just to allow people, by specialization and complementarity, to work together more successfully than they could have worked as individuals. So the most basic logic of organizations is collaboration.
True. Things that we have neglected or omitted in IB research, or research about firms, research in strategic international management as well?
I mean, omitted is, frankly, I don't know. Perhaps I'm not very good at spotting gaps, but I think things that probably have been under-researched or underdeveloped, it seems to me in a way that there are two things that matter a lot, which have been understudied. One is very macro, to my mind. It's really institutional context. It's how the institutions of a particular environment, of a particular country, of a particular phenomenon, or the institution is guiding a particular phenomenon actually work. So I don't think we can. I know that in some way we should strive for context-free universal theories. At the same time, I think we lose a lot by forgetting about context and not paying enough attention to context. And the other one is very micro. It's almost at the opposite end of the macro-micro spectrum, which is, I was struck when I was young. I was struck by when I was a young student. I was struck by something that was one of Michel Crozier's mottos. I was not quite a student, but I was working with his disciples. And Crozier was always saying, organizations don't have strategies, people do. And I think we sometimes breify the organization, or we sometimes lose track of the individual in action within the organization. So I try, again, when I was saying earlier, I try to observe people at work, if I can. We need to come down to the level of the individual actor, not to treat the firm as a rational entity, a rational actor, but to basically try to open it up and understand the people within it.
About scholarship, creativity in scholarship, intellectual curiosity, what does your mind think of when it wanders freely in the state of idle curiosity? How do these interesting creative ideas come about?
Yes. Yes. Sorry, I'm just pausing 1 second, but I mean, one observation, obviously, which is just a hopefully a short-term one, is right now I find the question difficult real time because I can't help being very worried about Ukraine. So when my mind wanders, I wonder about the atrocities in Ukraine. In peaceful times, I would say, I've started to practice drawing. I did not do it when I was young, but I'm drawing and painting. And I find it remarkable. It's an intense effort. It's tiring, but it's a remarkable way to take your mind off some intellectual issues, works very differently, and then come back to them. So this shifting between the kind of work we typically do as scholars and shifting what I try to do as someone who draws, someone who observes. I also take photographs fairly often. So I look at from landscapes to buildings to people and so on, trying to basically do something which is eyes and mind mobilizing, but not intellectual. And I think that helps, but to me, I believe that helps some, perhaps creativity is a big word, but it helps me make sense of things, perhaps discover some linkages and so on. The other thing is, I'm a big data fan, data in the broadest sense. I mean, interview notes, videos, and so on, as well as quantitative data. And I think if you dive into data often enough, and you do it in a kind of iterative, recursive way, so you don't jump into conclusion, but you go through several loops of trying to develop conceptualizations and then going back to data and so on. That is a way to, it's not exactly creativity, but that's a way to tease out some interesting things from that data and perhaps to add some things conceptually.
If you could, thank you. If you could look into a crystal ball and say the next 5 to 10 years of the IB, international strategy, international competitive dynamics in Europe, in the world, regionally or locally, or globally, what's the next big area that we should be looking into or worried about?
I mean, in some ways, and I don't know whether it's going to be a return to where we were, say, 50 years ago or 40 years ago, or it's going to be different. But I think, and it's probably obvious, so I'm sorry for starting by stating the obvious, but the form of liberal globalization that we have seen progressing for the last at least 20, 30 years or more, I think is going to be challenged. It was already being challenged by social inequalities and other factors prior to COVID. I think COVID has led the immediate environment, be it national or even local, become more important. And my sense is I have no idea I don't claim to have any idea about what will be the consequences of the war in Ukraine, but I think one consequence will be that companies will be more risk averse, will be less willing to build or to remain in global supply chains. You look at the dependency today of the global semiconductor industry on Taiwan, and that's probably a forerunner of moves in other industries as well. So the globalization we have seen is going probably to go into reverse, to be reduced, or perhaps to, whether it's going to be regional, like many people argue, whether it's going to be more local, I don't know. But it's clear that the dynamics of the international system, or perhaps the nature of the international system, are going to change. I think that's one. And the consequence of this, as I see it, is that when companies moved from being multinational to being like the companies like Sumantra Ghoshal and I and others were studying, matrix organizations, complex, global and local at the same time, to becoming even more global and more globally run with global functions and global organizations. I have there was an article on the evolution of Unilever recently, which shows this. The traditional general management skills or multinational management skills were in less demand. I think we could almost say, Pankaj Ghemawat years ago had this formula of the semi-globalized world and saying multinational management belongs to the semi-globalized world. And I think the world had shifted toward globalized and now it's shifting back. towards semi-globalized, and management is actually more complex. I think the managers I was researching and interviewing in the late 1970s, 1980s had more demanding tasks in front of them than global managers have had for the past few years, in the past few years. So I think there will be a move back to probably giving more attention to the work of managers in multinational companies or in semi-globalized companies.
I mean, you mentioned something interesting, liberal globalization and the impact of it going forward. There was an interview a couple of years ago at Chicago, Mearsheimer and Posner, they were having the two series of multiple day interviews at the University of Chicago. And they actually saw it as a social construction, like, or re-engineering of the societies. I'm really curious about what you just said about liberal globalization and about the culture of IB research and evolution that we are going to be, just started mentioning about it from 1970s, 1980s. From where we were, 1970s, where are we headed to going forward? The evolution of IB, given that these ideologies are changing, moving away from globalization to more nationalism. And some of my guests here, they are either on the globalization side, very much hoping that the globalization is going to increase even further, or they are on the other side, they are saying, oh, actually it's going to be just downhill from now on. What's your take on it?
Well, I think globalization is going to be, I think the move toward greater, freer global world, a greater, freer global world is going to go into reverse. How far it will go into reverse, I don't know, but it was clear already with Donald Trump and trade wars. It is clear with COVID. It is likely to be a further consequence of the point I was making about companies are going to be more risk averse following COVID, following Ukraine, and so on. So I think there will be a move backward from globalization.
Okay.
At the same time, global companies or multinational companies will continue to exist. So, and in a way, I was just raising the issue of saying there will probably, again, a greater demand for international management skills as such. That is both an opportunity for research, it's perhaps an opportunity for our teaching, and my own experience is managers in multinational companies, when I was teaching them or working with them in the 80s when I started, were more sophisticated people than their counterparts today, just because I think they had more experience of different contexts and different roles in multinational companies.
Interesting. So you're saying that they lost the complexity?
Complexity decreased. I don't think and therefore the need for it was less. Now, perhaps you can argue that if there is greater volatility, greater instability, more surprises, and very high interdependence globally, then you have all the ingredients of complexity coming to play again, and that has been taking place for the past few years, and I think it's going to take to be even more significant in the coming years.
Okay. Yves, what was the best advice you received when you were going through your education, your training?
I think it was probably coming from, I mean, my mentor at Harvard was Joe Bauer, and Joe Bauer was very influential in me, and I think he gave me some very valuable advice, saying he did not quite frame it that way. Now it would be called mechanisms. You have to understand the mechanisms by which organizations operate, or by which people operate in organizations. He was using a different terminology around strategic context and structural context and so on, but essentially the rules of the game within the organization and the mechanism. And to some extent, and interestingly enough, they became friends with each other. I had the same learning from Michel Crozier in a French context, the same kind of learning. Except with Crozier, I never was a student, but I worked closely with some of the people who had been his students, who were colleagues at INSEAD and elsewhere.
I see. If you were to give advice to junior faculty or PhD students for a successful career such as yours, what's the best advice that you would give them?
Well, I think today, what I find remarkable, and again, this is someone who has almost 50 years of experience with this. When I started, research methods in international business, in fact, research methods in business in general, were very underdeveloped. So you had just traditional, you had basically people who were doing cases a la Harvard Business School 1960s or 70s. And you had people who were doing relatively simple-minded econometric analysis or statistical surveys and so on. The most sophisticated work was being done by Ray Vernon and the team around him, who were looking at the spread of multinational companies from the US, from Europe, and so on. What I'm struck with is that a lot of scholars have given a lot of attention to qualitative research methods in the past couple of decades, perhaps the past 20 years. I find it very significant that the Gibbs Decade Award was given to a paper on basically qualitative research methodology this year. So my first advice would be really study research methods thoroughly and on a wide range. You don't need to master all because you cannot. But even if you are doing mathematical modeling, don't ignore the people who do ethnographies, and read some about ethnographies and this kind of work. If you are doing case studies, look at large sample statistical data and so on and so on. So you see, just trying to get a rounded understanding of multiple research methods, which were very underdeveloped when I was a student, and have become, I think, so much more sophisticated now that they're very helpful. I would also borrow an advice from Jim March, actually, which I found very, very interesting. He used to say, be a scholar for the fun or the interest of being a scholar, and enjoy scholarship. And then you will write papers naturally. So put scholarship before being desperate for publication. And what I see among students, given the pressures of promotion criteria, tenure criteria, and so on, there's a tendency to what I see as being, you put publishing first and doing research second, or perhaps you put the cart before the horse, if you want that metaphor. And people are very worried with publication. They are not so concerned about becoming a successful scholar, enjoying the work of scholarship. So I think the advice from Jim is very, very profound. You just say, be a scholar and enjoy being a scholar, and then publications will come. Don't put it the other way around.
But there's also a time factor. I mean, yes, he is right, and you touched on a great point. But I'm thinking about our new current PhD students on the job market. When you apply for a job, they are looking at how many publications we have in top.
I know.
Yes. So interesting. Let me ask you the reverse version of this question. What are some of the big mistakes that you see people make? Things that they should avoid doing, wrong things to do in the field, in the profession?
Well, there are some. Again, by and large, I esteem and I respect and even I admire a number of my colleagues. So I'm not someone who's going to harp upon these are bad things to do and these are terrible mistakes and so on. What I see sometimes as issues today are twofold. It seems to me, I mean, at least two come to mind. One is to try to extract from a particular concept or a particular theory more than it can deliver. In the sense, for instance, if I look at international business, there has been for a number of years this piggybacking on transaction cost economics. Transaction cost economics are very good to justify the boundaries of a firm. Basically to say what should be externalized, what needs to be internalized, and so on. That works. To tell you how to run relationship within the firm, they make a series of assumptions which are essentially against collaboration. I was saying earlier, a firm is all about collaboration. And transaction cost economics do not encourage collaboration. So I think that's one point of using the wrong framework for trying to go after a particular topic. That framework may be powerful and respected and well established, but it is good for something else. I think that's one. That's one mistake. The other one I see often is confusing the map and the territory. The map is a conceptual apparatus, like a map, but the map is not the territory. The territory is real. The map is a representation of the territory. And sometimes, we get carried, what is the right word? Carried away by our conceptualizations into almost believing that the conceptualization is not a representation of reality, necessarily simplified and schematized, but is the reality itself. And I think if we lose that distinction, then we are off on a tangent. I mean, we are not. It's one of the reasons I believe. If you look at it today, as compared again to many years ago, it used to be quite. If you were smart enough to show why it was interesting and so on, it used to be relatively easy for us to get access to big multinational companies and do research. They would open their doors and say, go around and interview 200 people if you wish, and so on, so long as you don't disturb too much and so long as you don't require money to do it, we'll let you do it. I hear my junior colleagues, and I'm probably right, saying it has become much more difficult. And I think part of this is that the relevance to management practice and the mutual respect between practitioners, between managers and scholars somehow has been lost. I think one thing I learned from C.K. Prahalad early on, mainly from C.K. Prahalad early on, is you need to respect and try to develop empathy for managers and their predicament and their situations. And my sense is we don't do enough of that.
Interesting. This was interesting. This was very helpful. For the sake of time, what's a question that I should have asked you but haven't?
I thought, no, actually, I mean, this is also a good, I thought you would ask me what did I learn the most from? Okay. And that's a nice way to end, that it's a nice sequel to what we were discussing a minute ago. Because first of all, I'm a bit unusual, I guess, among scholars. Because one, I've learned a lot from managers. I have found senior managers or managers in general, so long as you can adopt the right language to interact with them, they are actually very smart, thoughtful, and careful. When I go back and I think about all these, actually I've kept most of them. When I look at the interview notes I accumulated over decades, I think I learned a hell of a lot from these meetings and interviews and so on. And also it's interesting, a couple of examples, personal examples. I did this work with Mikko Kosonen, a Finn who was the head of strategy for Nokia and then and basically became a co-researcher. We wrote a book together, and he was really a closet academic. I was amazed. He asked me, how can I learn about all this? I was lazy. I sent him the link to the whole bunch of PhD readings in strategic management that we have. dozens and dozens, perhaps hundreds of articles. And that was not terribly hopeful. And at the end of the summer, he came back to me and he had read them all and he had made sense of most of them and so on. So he was a closet academic, really. He had spent his vacation reading academic journals. And another one that there is another example like this, someone named Jose Santos, who was the CEO of a company and went all the way to now becoming an academic. And also I wrote some articles and books, had a book with him. So I found that these people were in between, or were in movement between management and academia, are actually people you can learn from a lot. And I was also, I was very fortunate in a sense because, a lot of, I had the good fortune to work with C.K. Prahalad, and it was totally serendipitous. We just happened to be, Harvard allocated us to the same PhD cubicle. So we found ourselves like, face to face, 1 meter apart, sharing the same tiny office. And obviously we started chatting and we became good friends and co-authors and co-researchers and so on. I also worked with many others. So in a sense, I think I had the good fortune to meet very interesting people. And also what I learned about organizations, again, I mentioned Joe Bauer earlier, I mentioned Crozier earlier. There was someone else, Jiro Nonaka, and all of his work on not so much Japanese companies per se, actually, but the nature of company and knowledge in companies and so on. I had the good fortune to be invited at some conferences in Japan when I was young, and to meet Jiro and people who were working with him. So I learned from a lot of people, and I'm very sad in a sense. Sometimes Sumantra Ghoshal disappeared early. Gunnar Hedlund, who was also one of the forerunners, also died very young. He died of brain cancer. He was not even 40, or perhaps just 40. CK died somewhat very prematurely. He could have been productive till today, but he died a dozen years ago. So unfortunately, several of the leading scholars in management passed away in a premature way. But I learned a lot from all these people.
Now I learned from you. Thank you so much for this interview. This was very interesting. Thank you for your time. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. This was very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.